The galaxy of the 41st millennium is a crazy place where impossible things happen every single day. It's a wildly over-the-top universe filled with some pretty insane stories and characters, many of which tragically don't get nearly enough attention. Well, today we're going to do our part to fix that, as we're going to talk about that time that two orcs and a squig managed to kill a titan. They took down one of the god engines with nothing more than a fast car, a snaz hammer, and some truly brutal cunning.
He said it! He said it!
And hey, look at that. That's actually the name of the book this story comes from. This is definitely one of my favorite 40k books, and I've read through it like 3 times. So in the interest of avoiding spoilers for people who haven't read it yet, we're just going to be talking about one scene that happens in the middle of the book that doesn't give away any of the major plot reveals. It's one of the most wild things I've read in a 40k novel in a really long time, so more people need to know about it. But before we get into all of that, here's a quick shout out to this video's sponsor, which is actually a brand new Warhammer game on PC. From the makers of Horus Heresy Legions comes its spiritual successor, Warhammer 40,000 Warpforge, a genre-defining collectible card game with fast strategic gameplay, innovative game modes, awesome art, and a clear passion and love for Warhammer 40,000 showing through in every detail. Whereas its predecessor was set in the dark days of the Horus Heresy, Warpforge is finally moving the story forward 10,000 years, and is set in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. The game will be launching with 6 different playable factions, each of which being explored through the game's campaigns, including the stalwart forces of the Space Marines, the sinister armies of Chaos, the ancient Craftworld Eldar, the undying Necron dynasties, the voracious Tyranid Swarm, and everybody's favorite, the Orks, as well as a whole bunch of modes specifically designed for fans of collectible card games, like draft and constructed competitive modes, featured in both regular play and time-limited competitions, each with a whole host of unique rules of engagement that will make every match feel completely unique and challenging. Additionally, you and your allies will be able to take part in massive alliance wars, which will test the mettle of even the most seasoned veterans. Warforge is going to be launching sometime next year, but if you're fast, you can play it for free on Steam between now and October 10th, as part of the Steam Next Fest. So click on the link in the description of this video to check the game out for yourself. The demo features the Ultramarines and the Orcs of the Goth clan, each with a unique playstyle that was tailored around their lore. An extra big thank you to Warhammer 40,000 Warpforge for sponsoring this video. And with that out of the way, let's get into the grimdark. So in the book, the Orcs of the Mech Lord's Tech Wog are invading the Forge world of Hephisto. The Wog is made up of orcs from all different clans, but most numerous are that of the orcs of the Bad Moons clan. And although not technically part of this particular Wog itself, the world is also being invaded by a sizable force of orc freebooters, led by Captain Badrock. Now you could be forgiven for thinking that this was a combined force, different orc groups setting aside their differences to team up against their enemies. But that couldn't be further from the truth. They both just kind of showed up around the same time, and both wanted to loot the Forge world for themselves. So all of the orcs have a tentative alliance, not to shoot each other in the back, but each one of them is trying to, quote-unquote, get to the good stuff first. It's a friendly competition between orcs and a brutal Armageddon for the humans on the world below. Now, skipping ahead a little bit, the battle on the planet's surface has escalated quite a bit. The Mechanicum has deployed 4 of their titans against the orcs, only for the orcs to respond by unleashing the Mecha Gargant, a colossal monument to the ingenuity of orc engineering. This is the pride and joy of the Techwog's leader, the Mech Lord, and the Mech Lord enjoys using the orcs' teleporter technology to make this monstrosity appear out of thin air, right on top of the enemy. That always made for a pretty good laugh. When the Mecha Gargant teleported in, it immediately destroyed one of the enemy titans, much to the amusement of all of the orcs on the battlefield. It didn't take long for the humans to adapt, and the 3 remaining titans split off into different directions and began to fire on it from all sides. Their firepower wasn't enough to break the Mecha Gargant's shields, but even still, it wasn't going to last forever under such sustained firepower from 3 different enemy titans. Not to mention, the 2 Warhound titans were smaller and thus were able to dodge and weave some of the incoming fire, which was absolutely ridiculous to the orcs. What's the point of being in a Gargant if you're gonna dodge? Now this is where the orc known as Ufak comes in. He's sitting there looking out at the titanic battle taking place in front of him. Massive guns that shake the earth with every single shell are being fired back and forth, lobbed through the air at the massive gods of war. All of the shots from the Mecha Gargant are exploding against the shimmering void shields of the Titans, and they're not really doing much damage. Ulfthak looks around, first at the Titan's void shields, then over at the orc fuel silos, where a fight had broken out amongst a bunch of speed freaks who were trying to be the first to refill their tanks so they could go charging back into the fight. Then his gaze shifted out past them to a bunch of Hume highways and overpasses that had been smashed up by the fighting of the Titans. Ulfthak looked down at his snazhammer and then finally over at his mate, Malgrot Redtooth, said to be utterly deadly in combat and about as intelligent as a lobotomized grot. All of the gears started turning in his orky brain, and he got a right cunning idea. He tells the other orc boys to go out into the fighting, that him and Malgrot had a special plan they was cooking up to help the mech lord and his Gargan. After the lads had taken off, Malgrot turned to Ulfthak and asked,
"So what is we doing anyways, boss?" Just stick close to me, Malgrot. This is either gonna be brilliant, or we's gonna die all spectacular like. What's that mean? Means with a right big explosion and that. Sounds good to me, boss.
The way they figured it, if it was an orc's time to meet Gork and Mork, they might as well do it in the biggest, flashiest, loudest way possible. And the more explosions, the better. So here's what the boys did. They ended up stealing a shock jump dragsta from one of the speed freaks by clobbering the git with Ulfthak's snazhammer. After their ride had been secured, he grabbed the weedy little Gretchen that had been working on the bike and asked him if he knew how the thing worked. The Gretchen nodded in response and said that he normally shoots the gun. That was good enough for Ulfthak. So the two orcs, the grot, and Ulfthak's pet squig all jumped into the dragsta and took off.
You was right, boss. This was a great plan. You idiot. There's more to the plan than that.
Now, not being members of the Cult of Speed themselves, Malgrot and Ulfthak had made fun of the speed freaks plenty of times in the past. But here on the open road in the dragsta, Ulfthak had to admit that there was something kinda badass about tearing over the ground in a vehicle like this. He thought about it for a minute, but he figured at the end of the day, he'd still want to get out and crack some heads the proper way. But he got the appeal. Ulfthak stared down at the Gretchen and said,
The shock jump. How's it work?
Oh, that's the shocker, right? Oh, when you're going fast enough, you hit the shocker, and then the shock jump happens. Or sometimes it don't happen.
Why don't it happen?
Oh, that would be a bit more of a technical matter, boss.
And how fast is fast enough?
Oh, pretty soggin' fast, boss. But if you was asking for an exact figure,
Never mind all that. Malgrot, take that turn coming up on the right. The one that which takes us towards the Gargans, boss. That's the one. Punch it!
The orcs careened wildly across the battlefield towards the battling god engines. Malgrot said,
Boss?
with a very uneasy voice, which demonstrated a remarkable amount of foresight into the implications of future events. Ulfthak clearly had not given him enough credit.
I think we's running out of road. Just keep it floored. We don't need it.
The orcs, the Gretchen, and the squig careened over the gorge, their dragsta launching into the air. And at that exact moment, Ulfthak slammed his hand down on the big red button, and a massive spinning purple portal materialized in front of them. The boys flew through the vortex, being bombarded with an accelerating riot of colors. Everything was very loud and had lots of teeth. And then almost as suddenly as reality had warped, the real world exploded all around them once again. And the enemy Titan was much, much closer. The shock jump dragsta collided with the Titan's shoulder, launching the boys and the squig out of the cockpit and sending them tumbling across its metal frame. The impact was strong enough that it actually caused the Warlord Titan to lurch and try to correct itself. Ulfthak started falling over the side and had to very quickly slam his snazhammer into the metal plating to keep himself from falling to his death. At that exact moment, the grot from before started tumbling past him over the edge. And on its way down, Ulfthak tried to kick him. Not for any real reason other than it would have been funny. But the Gretchen managed to latch onto his leg.
Thanks, boss. Oh, I thought I was a goner.
Him and the grot climbed back up onto the shoulder, and there waiting for him was Malgrot and his squig.
So what's the plan now, boss?
Now, right before Ulfthak could respond, there was a blinding flash of red light. The pair of them turned and looked across the battlefield and saw that the mech lord's mecha Gargan had turned its gaze of Mork on them. They should have been instantly incinerated, but they weren't.
Why ain't we dead, boss?
Ulfthak pointed up at the shimmering void shields above them.
The shields! The drags that took us right through it! Zogging hell! That was a pretty good plan after all, boss! Told yous it would be!
It took a little bit of maneuvering and shimmying along the side of the Titan, but eventually the crew ended up on top of its head, leaning forward to look down into its face. Ulfthak was pretty sure that the humans crewing it would be inside the head, and going through the eyes was their best way of getting inside.
Yous don't think they got a gazer morgue, do they, boss? Course they don't, you idiot, 'cause they ain't got a morgue. They's just got that Emperor kit, and I don't think he does zog all. Bloody useless god if you ask me.
On the count of 3, the crew dropped down in front of the Titan's eye and smashed through it. The humies inside started wailing in alarm, in that annoying high-pitched human noise they make when they're scared. The humans panicked, reaching for their weapons, but they were way too close to Ulfthak, who batted one aside with his snazhammer, pulping him into red mist, whilst grabbing the other one around the head with his enormous fist. There was a crack and something gave way, and suddenly his hand was all sticky and wet. Ulfthak dropped the limp corpse on the ground and shook the blood off his hands. Zogging humies. They were always leaking at the slightest provocation. In that moment, a tech priest rounded on the massive orc, and its appearance admittedly caught him off guard. It was a flailing mechanical thing, covered in metal arms. Mogrot emptied his slugga into the tech priest's chest, and ended up saving Ulfthak's life. And just like that, the threat had been eliminated. There was a lot less resistance than they had anticipated. The pair of orcs started looking around, and the inside of the cockpit was covered in all kinds of knobs, levers, and shiny buttons. The orcs were trying to figure out what to do next. The plan had worked perfectly, and honestly, way better than it had any right to have. Ulfthak scratches his chin and thinks to himself, if him and Mogrot can figure out how to pilot this thing, maybe he can keep it. Have his own Gargan. If only a couple of humies could figure out how to do it, then he certainly could too. It's in this moment that they notice a swirling tube of liquid at the back of the chamber. They hadn't noticed it before because it didn't really pose any kind of threat. But now that the orcs looked at it more closely, they could see there was a naked, almost crippled-looking human floating in the tank. It certainly looked like a humie, but it was kind of gross. It was all gray and withered. Humies normally came in shades of brown and pink. Not a good strong green like the boys, but certainly not gray either. And this thing was skinnier and more skeletal than most of the humies they had ever seen. The creature also didn't have eyes, or at least it had a series of thick cables coming out of where its eyes should have been. It had all manner of other cables and wires trailing out of its back and up to the top of its tube.
Right. Now that's the weirdest thing I've seen today.
Ulfthak aimed his shotgun at the princeps of the Titan and fired. It blasted apart its tank, and amniotic fluid gushed out and spilled across the floor. The humie limped forward, held up only by its cables. It was in this moment that the grot from before, who had waited behind on top of the Titan, had jumped down and come through the open window, running away from the squig that was trying to eat it. Right at the last second, it dodged, and the squig that was lunging for it slammed into the Titan's princeps, who latched onto its face and started to rip it apart. There was a massive shudder that went through the entire Titan as it lurched back and forth, it's still connected to its princeps that was being mauled by a squig. The Titan discharged all of its guns at once in random directions, and then suddenly fell very still. The orcs then heard a little bit of shuffling coming from underneath them, and realized that there was still more humies aboard. Ulfthak lifted a latch in the floor, dropped in a stick bomb, and then slammed the hatch shut. There was a big explosion, and then an alarm started going off. At first, the orcs thought the alarm was to signal that all of the humans were dead, but then they thought about it for a second. Why would a humie alarm go off if they're all dead and there ain't no one to hear it? Ulfthak pulled the hatch back open and looked down into the chamber. There was a pretty large amount of damage. There were sparks flying everywhere and small fires had begun to break out. There was also an exploded humie pilot whose remains were dripping off of the wall and ceiling. This was a lot of damage that looked suspiciously like that of a stick bomb going off in a tight enclosed space.
Bloody shoddy humie work. We need to get out of here before the whole thing blows up.
Ulfthak walked back to the entrance that they had made in the Titan's head and looked down. It was a pretty far way to go, so they checked to the back to see if there was another way out. While they were looking around, Ulfthak took a moment to look at the top of the tank that the gray broken humie had been in before, and he sees some humie glyphs carved into a bronze plate at the top of the tank. Now, most Humies spoke the same language, and he had picked up enough of it in order to interrogate prisoners or order Humie slaves around. But their writing was tricky. The glyphs represented sounds instead of concepts, which he thought was incredibly stupid and inefficient, just like most of the things that Humies did. But he knew enough of their written language to make a good guess of it. He tried to sound it out, and to his credit, he got pretty close.
Princess!
The thing in the tank had been a princess, or perhaps was princess. He nudged the squig with his boot, still eating away at the dead thing on the floor.
You like that? Yous want the name of what yous killed? You wanna be princess then?
The squig looked up and grinned at him with big bloody teeth.
Right, yous princess then. Good squig. Boss, we've got a different problem now.
Mogrot said, and the two orcs looked out across the battlefield. Since the titan they were inside had stopped firing, the orc Gargan had turned its attention to one of the smaller titans instead, and it had used its massive lift-a-droppa to levitate the smaller god engine into the air, spitting in the face of this world's gravity. Seeing such a massive metal monstrosity floating around in the air with its legs kicking back and forth uselessly was right funny to the pair of orcs. However, things got a lot less funny when they realized where the Gargant's pilot was aiming its catch. Now, the void shields of a titan are incredibly impressive, but they do have limitations, and having a literal titan thrown at them was just beyond their capabilities. The two titans collided with each other, but to the warlord titan's credit, having a warhound thrown at it wasn't quite enough to take it down. It only wobbled. Mogra and Uthak laughed, but then the wobble tilted slightly further, just beyond the tipping point, and the whole titan toppled backwards, with the orcs still inside. They both grabbed onto the walls and secured themselves as best they could, as the titan came crashing down. When it impacted, they were flung backwards and crashed into the wall, with all of the bloody Humie bodies crashing on top of them. Remarkably, they were uninjured, and Uthak considered that he had spent far too much time today in large metal vehicles that were about to crash into something, when all a proper orc wanted was to smash a few Humies and steal some right good gubbins. He forced some air back into his lungs and pushed off a dead Humie.
Mogrot, you's dead. No, boss. But what do we do now? We got to zog out of here, that's what.
The faceplate that they had entered through was now the ceiling, and it was going to be quite a climb to get back out of it.
Boss, look! I think that's a door!
The Gretchen said, pointing at the wall that was actually the roof of the chamber. And sure enough, it looked like a door, and had one of those dumb wheels that Humies like to put on their doors, which never really made sense to Uthak. How can you steer a door? The crew climbed out of the door and onto the Titan's body, and it was at this point that Uthak noticed that the Titan head was more centered in its chest, compared to where a Humie's head should be above the shoulders. It looked more like an orc, which was definitely why it was so shooty. If Titans had been shaped like humans, they would probably just walk around the battlefield doing nothing of importance, looking stupid until they eventually got killed. The boys looked around the battlefield and saw two groups charging in their direction. One side, filled with the warriors of the Mechanicus, armed with shields and pointy sticks that shot lasers, and on the other side was the rest of the boys. They were charging in the direction of the fallen Titan, which didn't seem like the smartest thing to do considering the warning sirens that it was blaring. But then again, Humies never really did make much sense to him. Uthak started to formulate a plan, saying that they should link back up with the boys. But before he could finish his sentence, Mogrot screamed his war cry and jumped down the Titan.
Come and have a go then, if that thinks it's hard enough.
Now the two of them had just killed a Gargan, and the most sensible thing to do was to bag themselves some right good loot. But Uthak would take orders from a grot before he let Mogrot run into a fight while he hung behind.
Sorry, I guess we's doing this.
He let out a fierce wah of his own, ran forward, and leaped clean into the air, not even bothering to hop down the side of the Titan like Mogrot had. He hit the ground hard, but his legs were up to it, and he thundered towards the oncoming Humie horde. There was still a bleeding hole in his side, where a Humie with a claw weapon had stuck him good earlier in the day. It stung pretty bad, but then again, what was life if you didn't get reminded how close it sometimes came to ending.